All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Tonight, we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of pilots find both exciting and maybe a little bit intimidating: night flying.
Yeah, night flying has this whole mystique around it, doesn't it?
It definitely does. So, tonight, we're going beyond those basic checklist items and really diving deep into some fascinating aspects of night operations. And to guide us through this, we're turning to a trusted source: the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 11. You ready to unlock the secrets of the night sky?
Let's do it. It's all about understanding how our perception changes when that sun dips below the horizon. Even the FAA's definition of night is a bit more nuanced than you might think.
Oh, okay, let's unpack that. So it's not just about darkness.
Not quite. It's actually tied to specific periods of twilight. You know, that time when the sun's below the horizon, but there's still some light in the sky. Specifically, civil twilight is what the FAA uses to determine when those night lights are required.
Ah, so there's a technical definition to when night actually begins for pilots.
Exactly. And you know what's really handy? The FAA has this online tool where you can calculate those exact twilight times for any location. Super helpful for planning those flights near dawn and dusk.
I can already see myself using that tool, double-checking those times just to avoid any surprises. But let's talk about something even more fascinating, something that really gets to the heart of night flying: night vision.
Mm.
I remember learning about those rods and cones way back in school, but how does all that translate to actually seeing or not seeing in the cockpit at night?
Well, those rods, there are dim light heroes. They're incredibly sensitive, allowing us to pick up even the faintest glimmers of light. But as with most things, they have their quirks.
Quirks, huh? Like what?
Well, there's this thing called the night blind spot. Imagine this. You're flying along and you're staring directly at a dim light off in the distance, and then poof, it just disappears.
Wait, what? That sounds a bit unnerving.
It can be. What happens is the rods responsible for that central vision, they're actually not as sensitive in low light conditions. That's why it's so important to use a scanning technique. By constantly shifting your gaze, you're actually using your peripheral vision, where those rods are more concentrated, to pick up those faint lights. It's like a built-in night vision hack.
So instead of staring, we need to train our eyes to dance around a bit. That makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about all those dim lights and markers we need to see on the ground at night. But hold on, isn't our vision also affected by more than just the amount of light?
Oh, absolutely. Factors like fatigue and stress can have a huge impact on what you see at night. Even things like uncorrected vision or medications can play a role.
So we need to be extra mindful of our overall physical and mental state when preparing for a night flight.
Absolutely. And here's a surprising one. Smoking.
Smoking,
Yeah.
really? How does that come into play?
Well, you see, smokers actually experience what's called a physiological altitude because of the carbon monoxide in their blood. Their bodies are reacting as if they're at a higher altitude than they actually are.
So if you're smoking and flying at, let's say, 5,000 feet, your body might think you're actually up at 8,000 feet.
Exactly. And that can make them more susceptible to hypoxia, which can obviously impair judgment and decision-making, especially at night.
It's a stark reminder that our physical state directly affects our perception, and that's especially true when we're talking about night flying. Speaking of things that can mess with our perception, what about those infamous night illusions? Those always sound a bit spooky to me.
Oh yeah, they can be quite disorienting if you're not prepared for them.
Hmm.
Take the false horizon illusion, for instance. Imagine flying over a dark area, maybe a sparsely populated region, with city lights glowing off in the distance and stars above you. Your brain might actually have trouble distinguishing the true horizon, making you feel like the aircraft is tilted, even when you're flying straight and level.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that could be a real problem, especially when you're relying more on visual cues at night. Are there any others we should be aware of?
Well, there's autokinesis, where a stationary light, like a star, can appear to move. If you fixate on it for too long, you might start to feel like you're actually drifting off course. And then there's the classic black hole approach illusion. It's pretty common when you're approaching a runway that's surrounded by darkness, with very few surrounding visual cues.
I've heard about that one, something about the runway seeming out of position.
Exactly. It can make you misjudge your altitude and approach angle. It's easy to feel like you're higher than you actually are, which can lead to some, shall we say, interesting landings.
So we're talking about illusions that can literally make us question which way is up or down, which really highlights the importance of trusting our instruments, right? But speaking of tools, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the equipment we need in the cockpit. A good flashlight seems like a no-brainer, but what else should we consider?
It's not just about having the gear, it's about having it organized. Fumbling around in the dark for a chart or a flashlight can be a huge distraction, not to mention stressful. Before you even start taxiing, make sure to arrange those essential items, your flashlight, a spare set of batteries, pens, anything you might need in a way that's easily accessible.
I can definitely see the value in that. The last thing I want to be doing during a night flight is digging through my flight bag, trying to find a pen.
Exactly. Speaking of charts, have you ever thought about using adjacent charts for night flying?
Adjacent charts. Now, why would those be particularly helpful at night?
Well, think about it. You're cruising along at night, and suddenly a cluster of city lights pops up on the horizon. If you don't have those adjacent charts handy, you might not be able to quickly identify those landmarks and correlate them with your current position.
Good point. It's like needing a wider field of view on our charts to match our wider field of view at night.
Exactly. And here's another thing that might surprise you. Think twice before relying too heavily on red flight deck lighting.
Oh, that's interesting. I've always heard that red light is supposed to be better for preserving night vision.
Well, it's true that red light doesn't disrupt our night vision as much as white light. But the problem is it can distort the colors on those charts, making it harder to read those critical markings.
So it's a bit of a trade-off then.
Exactly.
Right.
My advice is to use red light sparingly and really only when absolutely necessary.
That makes a lot of sense. The last thing we need is to misread a chart because of our lighting choice. It's all about being mindful of how our environment can affect our perception and decision-making, especially at night. Okay, so we've talked about all the pre-flight prep and the importance of understanding our vision at night. Now let's get to the actual flying part. Imagine you're taxiing out for that first solo night takeoff. What's going through your mind at that point?
Well, I'd say it's probably a mix of excitement and maybe a little bit of healthy nervousness, right? It's important to remember, though, that while the airplane itself flies the same way at night, our perception of everything changes so much.
Oh, absolutely. It's like stepping into a whole different world out there. And we've talked about all those visual illusions and the limitations of night vision, so I can definitely see how that adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why the FAA Handbook really emphasizes relying on your instruments more heavily during a night takeoff. You see, those visual references that we often take for granted during the day, well, they might not be as available or as reliable at night.
So it's all about that instrument scan, making sure we're staying on top of airspeed, altitude, and heading.
Got it. But what about the climb out? What are some key things to keep in mind as we ascend into the night sky?
One thing that often gets overlooked, and this might sound a bit counterintuitive, is managing those flight deck lights. Believe it or not, dimming those lights can actually improve your outside vision.
Really? How does that work?
Well, think about when you come out of a movie theater on a bright, sunny day. Your eyes need a moment to adjust to that sudden change in light. Oh, yeah, it's almost blinding. So it's like giving our eyes a chance to adapt to the lower light levels outside the cockpit.
Exactly. By dimming those flight deck lights, you're giving your eyes a better chance to adapt to the darkness and pick up those subtle visual cues outside.
That makes sense. Are there any other tips specifically for that climb out?
The FAA Handbook recommends delaying turns until you've reached a safe maneuvering altitude.
That's interesting. Why is that different from a daytime climb?
Well, with limited visual references, it's easier to become disoriented during a turn at low altitudes. You might misjudge your bank angle or your altitude, which could increase the risk of getting too close to the ground or, other obstacles.
Oh, right, yeah. It's all about minimizing those chances of disorientation while we're still getting accustomed to that nighttime environment. Now, what about those landing lights? Do we keep those on during the climb?
That's a good question. While landing lights are super helpful for visibility during takeoff, the handbook points out that they can actually become less effective as you climb. They can even cause some distortion if they reflect off haze, smoke, or clouds at those higher altitudes.
So it's a judgment call based on the conditions.
Right. If you're clear of obstacles and those landing lights aren't really providing any benefit, you can consider turning them off to reduce that glare and maybe even improve your forward visibility.
Got it. Adapt and overcome. Now let's fast forward a bit. Let's say we've reached our cruising altitude and we're heading towards our destination. What are some key things to be aware of when it comes to orientation and navigation at night?
Well, we've already touched on the importance of having those adjacent charts handy, especially when those city lights start popping up on the horizon. But night flying really demands a heightened sense of awareness, even more so than daytime flying.
Oh, I can definitely see that. It's like all our senses are on high alert.
Exactly. For one thing, it's much harder to see clouds and other weather conditions at night, right? The handbook actually warns about the danger of accidentally flying into clouds, especially on those really dark nights or under an overcast sky.
So how do we avoid that? It's not like we can just flip a switch and suddenly illuminate those clouds ahead.
It really comes down to being extra vigilant. Pay close attention to those ground lights. If they start to disappear or become hazy, that could be a sign that you're flying into restricted visibility. And here's a little trick from the handbook. If you start to see a halo or a glow around those ground lights, that's often an indication of fog.
Wow, okay, that's really helpful. It's like those ground lights are sending us secret messages about the weather up ahead. But even when the weather is clear, it seems like those lights can still play tricks on us at night.
You're absolutely right. The FAA handbook talks about how lights can appear to be at different distances and sizes depending on your altitude. A group of lights that looks like one big blob from 5,000 feet might suddenly appear as individual lights as you descend.
Oh, wow, yeah. I can see how that would mess with your depth perception and make it tough to judge your altitude accurately.
Precisely. So we need to be extra careful about relying solely on what our eyes are telling us at night.
Right. It's like our eyes are playing a game of visual charades up there.
Exactly. So what's the best way to overcome these illusions and stay on track? Trust your instruments, cross-check that altimeter, vertical speed indicator, and heading indicator regularly to maintain that all-important situational awareness.
It's all about integrating those instrument readings with our visual perception to create a more accurate picture of what's going on. Now, I know we need to talk about landings. I think that's something a lot of pilots, even experienced ones, get a little nervous about at night.
Oh, I can definitely understand that. You're essentially landing in a world with fewer visual references, and those runway lights become your primary guiding stars.
Right, so we're not just casually looking for those runway lights, we're actively searching for them and making sure we know exactly where we are in relation to the runway environment.
That's a great way to put it. And even when you've spotted those runway lights, judging distance and altitude at night can be tricky.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine distance being very deceptive at night.
It absolutely is. And that's why the FAA handbook really stresses relying on your altimeter and airspeed indicator to maintain that safe glide path, especially when those ground references are limited. You don't want to be surprised by the runway suddenly appearing out of nowhere.
I've heard stories, but even with all these aids and procedures, there's still that thought in the back of my mind, what if something goes wrong? What if I experience an engine failure at night?
It's a valid concern, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's something every pilot should be prepared for. And the good news is the FAA handbook actually provides a very clear set of steps for handling just such an emergency.
Okay, so let's talk about that scenario that no pilot wants to think about, but every pilot needs to be prepared for, an engine failure at night. What are those immediate actions we need to take if that unthinkable happens?
Well, the first and most crucial step is to stay calm. Yeah,
Mm.
you've got to maintain control of the aircraft. You want to establish your best glide configuration and airspeed, and if possible, turn towards a safe area. Maybe an airport or a well-lit area, or at least away from any populated areas.
Okay, so it's all about those initial actions, buying us some time and putting us in the best possible position to deal with the situation. What happens next?
While you're gliding, you want to try to diagnose the problem, right? Check your fuel selectors, your magneto switch, your primer, anything that might have caused that engine to quit on you. If you can identify the issue, you might actually be able to restart the engine and avoid that forced landing altogether.
So we're not giving up hope just yet. We're actively troubleshooting while we're gliding. And what about communication? Should we be trying to reach someone?
Absolutely. If you're already talking to ATC or a Unicom, stay on that frequency unless they instruct you otherwise. Let them know what's happening and where you are. But even if you can't reach anyone, remember that a lot can still be done to increase your chances of a safe outcome.
It's reassuring to hear that we still have some control over the situation, even in an emergency. It's not just about hoping for the best, it's about taking action. So, let's say we've tried everything, but we just can't get that engine restarted, and we're committed to making a forced landing. What are some key things to consider for landing safely in the dark?
Okay, so first off, try to find a landing spot that's at least somewhat familiar to you, even if it's not lit. Knowing the terrain can be incredibly valuable in those low light conditions. And if possible, aim for an area that's near public access or a road. This will make it easier for rescue crews to find you if needed.
So it's like we're using our knowledge of the area to our advantage, even in this emergency situation. It's a reminder that preparation and familiarity can really pay off when things get tough. Any other tips for that final approach and touchdown?
Wind awareness is crucial. You definitely don't want to end up landing downwind. And just as you would for any normal landing, complete your before landing checklist. Even in an emergency, those procedures can really help maintain a sense of order and can prevent you from overlooking something important.
Right, it's about sticking to those familiar procedures, even when the situation feels anything but familiar. It helps keep us focused and on track.
And what about those landing lights? Do we use them during a forced landing?
Absolutely. Test them at altitude before you even start your descent and turn them on in plenty of time to illuminate any obstacles in your path. And, if for some reason your landing lights fail or you just don't have any outside visual references, you can always hold that level landing attitude until you feel the wheels touch the ground.
Wow, that's a great image to remember. Holding that attitude, even in the darkness, until we feel that reassuring bump of the wheels meeting the ground. It's like a final act of trust in ourselves and our training. Exactly. And remember, the goal is always to touch down at the slowest possible airspeed to minimize that impact. And once you've landed safely, the most important thing is to get out of the aircraft as quickly and safely as possible. Move to a safe distance away from the aircraft, just in case.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight, from those fascinating aspects of night vision to the importance of preparation and even those potentially life-saving emergency procedures. We've really gone deep into this world of night flying.
We have. And, it's all about respecting those challenges, preparing thoroughly, and always striving to learn more. And the great thing is there's a wealth of resources out there to support pilots who want to fly at night, including those FAA brochures and the Aeronautical Information Manual that we mentioned earlier.
Excellent point. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it's also peace of mind, especially when it comes to something as complex and potentially challenging as night flying. And hey, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all this information, don't worry, it's a lot to process. Just take it one step at a time, build up that experience gradually, and never be afraid to ask for help from those experienced instructors and fellow pilots. The night sky is waiting. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.